Good morning. Welcome to this webinar for the 911 grant program. All lines have been muted for this. We will be using the chat feature. If you want to ask any questions during the session, on the bottom of your screen, there are a series of bubbles. The one in the middle looks like a little cartoon box is the chat feature. It'll bring up the chat on the side, and you may use that to send your question to the presenters. When asking questions, please keep in mind that this is a webinar that includes a lot of different folks. So if you have questions about specific issues that you may have, this is probably not the appropriate venue, but we do want any questions about the grant program and the application process itself. So today, we're going to talk about a little introduction, some background on the office and on the grant, legislation and regulation, the grant information in detail, the application information, and then we'll talk about some tools and resources and questions that you have along the way. Today on the call, we have Lori Flaherty, who's the coordinator for the National 911 program from NHTSA, Dan Pythian from the Office of Public Safety Communications at NCIA, Colby Raschfeld, a contractor with the 911 program, and myself, Gordon Van Auken, who's a contractor with the National 911 program. The Implementation Coordination Office, that we commonly refer to as the National 911 Program Office, was implemented or created by the Enhanced 911 Act of 2004. It was a joint office between the Department of Commerce, NTIA, and the Department of Transportation's NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The Next Generation 911 Advancement Act of 2012 reestablished the Implementation Coordination Office. And one of the major responsibilities of the ICO is to manage the 911 program. Sorry, the 911 grant program. This time I'm going to turn this over to Colby to cover the legislation and regulation.
Thank you very much, Gordon. So the next few slides will provide a high-level overview of the legislation and regulations that are pertinent to the 911 grant program. The Next Generation 911 Advancement Act of 2012, which is codified at 47 U.S.C. 942, is the statutory basis for this grant program and implements modifications to the existing E911 grant program. 47 CFR Part 400 is the 911 grant program's implementing regulations and sets out the grant program's processes and requirements consistent with statute. The Notice of Funding Opportunity, which you'll often hear referred to as the NOFO, opens the application period and describes requirements under which the grants will be awarded. You'll want to ensure you read through the NOFO in its entirety. Next slide. The Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards can be found at 2 CFR Part 200. This regulation was adopted in December 2014 and consolidates duplicative guidance found in 8 OMB circulars. 2 CFR Part 200 governs the implementation and management of grants awarded, as well as outlines a set of principles for determining eligible or allowable costs. As the 911 grant program is jointly administered, 2 CFR Part 1201 relates to the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards that are specific to the Department of Transportation, while 2 CFR Part 1327 relates to the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards that are specific to the Department of Commerce. An essential aspect to ensure you are aware of can be found under 2 CFR Part 25. Under this regulation, an applicant is required to be registered in the System for Award Management, which is otherwise known as SAM, before submitting an application. An applicant must provide a valid, unique entity identifier in the application, as well as continue to maintain an active SAM registration with current information at all times during which there is an active federal award. Next slide, please. This wraps up the legislation and regulation overview. Please note the 911 Grant Program NOFO is the official grant document for this funding opportunity. Nothing in this document is intended to conflict with or supersede the NOFO. Any perceived conflict must be resolved by reference to the NOFO. Next slide.
Thank you, Colby. This time we're going to turn this over to Dan Pithian to talk about the grant process itself.
Thanks, Gordon. Turning to slide 11, Colby talked a little bit about the authorizing legislation, and this slide at a high level provides the intent of that act, of course, which is to help support through these grants the transition to next generation 911 for public safety answering points. The act broadened the eligible uses of funds from the previous iteration of the grant program, and also increased the federal share for grants from 50% to 60%. And the act authorized $115 million for this grant program, with the administrative costs for NTIA and NHTSA to implement the program. That leaves about $109 million to be awarded for the grants themselves. Turning to the next slide, some key documents that our agencies have published to help implement this program. Of course, the final rules for this program, Congress required the agencies to go through a rulemaking, and those final rules were published earlier this month. You can find those rules at that link. And most importantly, already talked about the NOFO. That NOFO was published a little bit later in August, and that can be found as well at that link. In terms of the eligible applicants for the grant program, we have, Congress set out at a pretty high level a lot of the specifics for this program, and in implementing them, we've obviously tracked those requirements closely. Eligible applicants, that's probably the question we've been getting most in our previous webinars and offline and individual calls to the agencies. Who are the eligible applicants? Per Congress, it's at the state level, States, District of Columbia, and other territories, and tribal organizations as defined in 25 U.S.C. 5304. Those are the eligible applicants. Get a lot of calls from local governments. Unfortunately, you are not eligible. You've got to work through your states or territories. Next slide. Again, tracking eligible use of funds that Congress set out at a high level. The grant program, again, I'm not going to read through this entire slide, but Congress set out at a high level what the eligible uses of the funds are for. And turning to the next slide, some of the specific allowable uses of those funds include personnel costs, salaries and fringe benefits for staff and consultants that are required for implementation of NG 911 services. Contractual costs are eligible, as spelled out on this slide. Costs associated with carrying out programmatic activities, including for the provision of NG 911 services or for consulting services. Have to remind you the recipients are responsible for monitoring activities and expenditures of your vendors and are responsible for ensuring that solicitation documents reflect activities that are within the eligible scope of the grant program. Turning to slide 17, hardware, software, hosted services costs are eligible. Recipients, again, must specify that the purchase of hardware, software, or services comply with current NG 911 standards as listed in Department of Homeland Security SAFECOM guidance. We'll note, though, that each individual project need not meet every listed standard. Slide 18, planning and administrative costs are also eligible. Costs incurred as a direct result of participation in the program, with the note that these are limited to no more than 10% of the grant funds. Planning and administrative costs. Recipients can use a portion of the funds allocated for your administrative services costs to perform an assessment of their current 911 system. You're required to use the NG 911 Readiness Scorecard that was produced at the FCC, their task force for optimal PSAP architecture. These include ongoing activities necessary to develop, modify, and improve the framework for state and tribal organizational NG 911 governance, strategic planning, and coordination. Training costs also are eligible. Costs directly related to NG 911 implementation for public safety personnel. The recommended minimum training guidelines for telecommunicators, which was produced over a period of years by the National 911 Office, has to serve as the base level for the training provided. Recipients have to provide documentation describing the training being provided and identify the included elements from those minimum training guidelines. Operational costs also are eligible. You can, with respect to cost to operate the NG 911 system as a dual system to the current legacy 911 system until such time as that legacy system is shut down and the NG 911 system is fully operational using only NG 911 technology. Questions come up in the previous webinar. We have not set any maximum period of time, during which this dual system operational costs are eligible. So that's an important note. Ineligible costs, costs that are unallowable under the 2 CFR Part 200 requirements. The regs at OMB are not eligible. Please note that ineligible costs may not be included as matching funds for this program under the match. Some specific ineligible costs under this program: costs to operate the legacy E911 or 911 systems. Again, costs to operate the NG 911 system after it is fully operational. Construction activities are not eligible, and independent verification and validation testing for products, services, and system purchases are also not eligible costs. Turning to the next slide, eligible matching funds. Again, the 911 program requires at least a 40% non-federal match. Applicants are going to have to document your capacity to provide matching funds. Funds that constitute the match must themselves be allowable project expenses. Cash or in-kind contributions are allowed, assuming they're consistent with 2 CFR Part 200. Remember that matching funds have to be applied towards the same project funded by the federal grant, and matching funds must be from the same fiscal period as the project funded by the federal grant. We're now going to turn this discussion over to Lori Flaherty at NHTSA.
Thanks, Dan. I'm looking at slide 25, titled Grant Timeline. So our hope and our estimated timeline for making awards to this grant program is that somewhere at the end of this calendar year, we will be able to make awards. Each awardee after that will be required to submit performance reports and financial reports. The financial reports are required to be submitted quarterly, and then we also require an annual performance report to be submitted. The period of performance for the project to be funded by this grant program is 4 years starting with the date of the award. So you have 4 years from the date of the award to expend the grant funds. And just as a note, this is not the kind of grant program where you get all the money up front. This is a reimbursable grant program, and I believe Gordon will get into that a little bit later. But for this grant program, we expect that you will incur expenses and then submit those expenses for reimbursement as they are incurred. Next slide. Moving on to application information. So we've given you information about sort of the who can apply, and what you can apply for. So we're going to move on to the application process itself. And as we worked our way through the process of the final regulations and the NOFO, we realized that probably the best way to do this would be to do it in 2 steps. The reason for that is that by statute, applicants do have to certify that you have not diverted any of your 911 surcharge funds. If you have seen the FCC's annual report related to that topic, you know that there are a number of states that will be ineligible to apply. We also know from the last round of grants that the match was a challenge for some states and territories. So we're going to do a 2-step process. In step 1, you will be asked to send in a certification that gives us 2 pieces of information. One, it designates the 911 coordinator or the person or government agency that will serve as the point of contact for this grant program. The second thing that the certification will tell us is that you have certified that you have not diverted any of your 911 surcharge funds. There are also a series of 4 boxes that you need to check on the certification. This was a question in the last webinar. The boxes are items that relate back to statutory requirements for this grant program, and I will just share them with you briefly. One is that you have coordinated your application with local governments, that you have established a plan for how you're going to spend the money, that you will only use 10% of the grant funds, as was mentioned, for your administrative expenses. In other words, what we say in the certification is that the state will ensure that 90% of the grant funds are used for the direct benefit of PSAPs. Now, whether or not you do a project at the state level that benefits the PSAPs or whether or not you do sub-grants to locals is entirely up to you. But this point just relates back to the fact that you can only use up to 10% for your administrative costs. Also, the last point on here is that you have integrated with your telecommunications service providers. And those are the vendors that not only deliver 911 calls to you, but the folks that provide other services, whether those be for CPE or other services. So in other words, we want to make sure that you have coordinated efforts not only with the locals, but with those services that become really important as you implement next generation 911. So that's what's included in step 1 of the application process, and the deadline for those certifications is September 10th. Once we get through that application deadline, what we will do is we will have the list of states, territories, and tribes that have chosen to apply. And as I mentioned before, this is a formula-based grant program, so once we know how many states, territories, and tribes will apply, We will then apply the formula to that list and publish very shortly thereafter a preliminary funding allocation list. In other words, this will be the list of all the states, territories, and tribes, and applying the formula, how much federal funding you stand to receive should you apply to the second part of the application process. So we'll release that, we'll publish that list on Grants.gov, and then there will be a 60-day application period for that second part of the application process, which is basically telling us how you're going to spend the money split out among the eligible costs, your 60-40 split, and all the necessary forms. And Gordon will go through that next. So as I mentioned before, we are going to do our best to get through that entire application timeline and make grant awards by the end of this calendar year. Next slide. As I mentioned before, step one, just to reiterate, because we've had a lot of questions on this, the certification is included in the NOFO. My recommendation is that you go to that and print out those 1 or 2 pages, that the single officer sign it, and that you send a signed PDF to us electronically. So the 2 things that are required to be included in that are the designation of a 911 coordinator. Now, if you don't have one in your state, then the governor can appoint someone to act as a single point of contact for this grant program. The certifications I've already gone through, so you have to comply with the statutory requirements that I mentioned before. You also have to certify that you have not diverted any of your 911 surcharge funds, and per statute, you have to certify that you haven't diverted any funds starting 180 days prior to your application. And that extends for the period of performance for the entire grant program. Next slide. There really is, not a strict format, but if you look at the NOFO, I'm not going to go through all of these, but it would be helpful to us if you conform to the requirements that are listed here, and that you submit them in a PDF format, and we will go through them all once we receive them. Next slide. Okay, for step one, that certification, as I mentioned before, if you go to the NOFO and you print out the 2 pages of Appendix A, if you are a state, that appendix includes all of the information that you need to submit for step one. Once that form has been signed and you have created a PDF, please send it to us at the email address you see there, nitsa.national911@dot.gov. As I mentioned before, the deadline for step one of the application process is September 10th. Late or incomplete applications and applications submitted by any other means will not be accepted. Next slide. Just to go over this again, because I know we've had a lot of questions. So once we get all of those certifications, we will have a list of who is going to apply to the grant program. We will then apply the formula again to that list and publish the list of allocations, the list of federal funds that each state, territory, and tribe will get if you choose to submit for step 2 of the process. The updated NOFO will also set the deadline for submission of complete application packets through Grants.gov. Right now, I think we're sort of hoping for a October 1 through December 1 deadline for that 60-day period, but it may shift a little bit one way or the other depending on how fast we can get through that interim process. But one way or another, the deadline, the hard deadline, will be published in the revised NOFO on Grants.gov, and we will let everybody know about that as well. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to go. Actually, I'm going to hand this over to Gordon now, who will talk specifically about the mechanics of submitting your necessary forms and requirements for step 2 of the application process. Gordon, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Lori. And we're going to take a pause here, and we're going to go back. We had a question as Dan was going over the eligible uses and ineligible uses. So the question came up that they sometimes use the term construction related to implementation and installation of required network elements. Can you explain what the grant term construction as an ineligible cost means?
I can give an example, and then if folks have further questions, please submit them to that nitsa.national911@dot.gov email address. Probably the best example I can give you is that, an ineligible use of funds for construction would be the construction of a building, a new building to house your public safety answering point. That's not an eligible use of funds. If you have any other questions that are more detailed, I think that may require both of our chief counsels to put their heads together, and we would be happy. We've been answering questions all along, and we would be happy to do that if you submit them to that email address.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to cover step 2 of the application process. And again, step 2 of the application process will begin after the revised NOFO is published. First step is you have to have a Grants.gov account, and then find the grant within the listed grants on the Grants.gov website. To apply for a Grants.gov account, there are several things that need to happen. First of all, you need to have a DUNS number. If you do not have one, you should allow at least 2 business days to process that. You also, as was talked about earlier, you have to register with the System Award Management, or SAM. That takes up to 2 weeks, possibly longer, depending on how long it takes you. It does require you to mail a notarized letter to them to get registered, so depending on how long that takes, that could increase that time frame. And then you have to have an application with Grants.gov itself, and we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the suggestions is that you start this process early. You don't have to wait for the NOFO to be published to have that. However, the fact that the eligible parties for this grant are primarily states and tribal organizations and territories, most of the folks that are eligible for this grant probably are already using Grants.gov and probably already have accounts there. So we highly recommend that you reach out to your office or other folks within your organization. There are folks that are experts in using Grants.gov that can help you through this process. So feel free to use the experts at your disposal. To actually apply for Grants.gov, you go to the website in the top right-hand corner. It will say Register. And you click on Register, and then it will bring up a page. They'll actually have a video that will walk you through the process if you want. Then you just click Register Now, and you start filling out your paperwork. So you have to complete all of your information. This will give you an opportunity to subscribe or unsubscribe to different communications so that you're aware of things that are coming. And you just work your way through that application process. Okay. One of the other things that Grants.gov allows you to do is called Workspace. Workspace is basically an online collaboration environment where multiple people with accounts, so if you have multiple people with accounts to Grants.gov, you can share a workspace that will allow you to work on a specific grant together. So if you do have a grants department in your state or an organization that does that and they already have an account for your state or territory, they will probably set up a workspace for you to be able to go in and access it so that multiple people can work on that. The link here will give you tutorials on how to set that up. Once you have your account set up, you log into your account and then you find the grant opportunity. The link here goes to the actual opportunity. If not, you can just go to Grants.gov, search for grants. You can either enter in 911 as a keyword, you can type in the opportunity number or the CFDA number. Both of those are listed on the NOFO and also on these slides. So we're going to talk about the standard forms, the plan, the budget, supplemental budget, and your indirect cost rate agreement if it applies. So first and foremost, a lot of people have had some questions on what is this 911 plan for the grant. First and foremost, this is not a strategic 911 plan or a statewide implementation plan. This is the plan on how you're going to use the grant funds. So it's more of a project plan than it is a strategic plan. I'm not going to go through all the stuff here. It's listed in the NOFO, but these are the key things that you have to have there. You have to explain what those projects and activities are. You have to make sure that they meet the guidelines of the grant, all allowable expenses. You have to establish metrics and timetables. How are you going to get it done? When is it going to get done? And then in addition to that, you need to describe the steps you have taken to coordinate the application with local governments, tribes, and others within your state or territory. Ensure that at least 90% of the grant funds are used as a direct benefit to the PSAPs. And as Lori mentioned earlier, involve integrated telecommunications services in the implementation and delivery of that. So those are the primary things that need to be in the plan. In addition to that, you need to do a budget. Just like any other grant, you have to say, this is what we want to use it for, this is what we think it's going to cost. So the project budget has to reflect the projects that you have in your plan. It must provide enough detail so the reviewers can interpret how the costs were estimated. So examples of, we have looked at our neighbor has done this and it cost them this, or we have gotten 3 estimates from 3 different vendors to come up with this number. Whatever method you use to try to come up with the number that goes in that budget document. Okay. You also have to make sure that the items and the information that's in the budget demonstrates that it meets the eligible use. And not more than 10% of the grant funds may be used for administrative purposes. In addition to that, you also have to identify the non-federal sources. So where are the funds coming from for your match? And again, it has to be at least 40% of the total project cost has to be from non-federal sources. Your project budget will also be on your standard form 424A. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you have to make sure that the costs proposed support the federal funds are from a non-federal match. Make sure that the dollar values that you have on both of those documents match on both the standard form 424 and the 424A. In addition to your project budget, in the event additional funding becomes available, whether that's from just as the revised NOFO distributes the money using the formula, if a state doesn't need all that funds, or save some money later, for whatever reason, there are additional funds available, you should submit a supplemental budget. It is optional, but it will make you eligible for additional funds potentially if they become available. So the supplemental budget needs to follow the same guidelines as your regular budget. It has to be eligible costs. You have to explain where the estimates are coming from, where the state match. The most important piece of the supplemental budget is to include the maximum amount of matching funds that you can provide. And that's the key to any possible distribution later. So, and again, if you want to apply for a supplemental budget, make sure that your plan also reflects those items. In step 2 also, you'll be using standard forms. By using Grants.gov, most of these forms are built into the system, so you will be filling them out and signing them electronically within Grants.gov, but the form and the links and information on them are listed down there. So you will need to make sure that the standard form 424, which is the application for federal assistance, the standard form 424A, which is the budget information for non-construction programs, a standard form 424B, which is your assurances, CD 511, which is your certification regarding lobbying, and standard form LLL, which is your disclosure of lobbying activities if it's applicable. Again, most of those forms are built into the Grants.gov system. Just briefly, we'll cover after award. So once all the grants and all the applications are brought in, you will get a notice of award. At that point in time, we will conduct training on the grant tracking system, or GTS, which will be the process with which the grant funds will be managed during the 4-year period. You will get an email with your username and password, and then you will be entering the information into the grants tracking system, and you will manage the project and go through using the grants tracking system. The grants tracking system will also be your way of getting reimbursement. As Lori mentioned earlier, this is a reimbursed grant. So you will enter in your basic, what your plan is based on your budget, and then as you have expenditures, you will go in and voucher against that project to get reimbursed. So before we get into tools and resources, let's go through a few of the questions here as we've been going through here. One of the questions was, are the slides going to be available after the webinar? Yes, they will be. We will be sending those out, and a couple of the tools we'll talk about here later, plus some links. One of the questions came in, should the Step 2 application be submitted as a single PDF? The process is to use the Grants.gov piece. That process includes a lot of filling in the blanks within the Grants.gov website. I don't know, Dan, do you know, I didn't ask Jennifer this, but I believe that the plan is uploaded separately from the budget, but I'm not sure.
I'm not sure of that as well.
Okay, we will have to get an answer for that one. Next one, mentioned that software is And eligible, does that include CAD systems or computer-aided dispatch solutions?
This is Lori. I tell you what, I think for that one, what we would prefer is to have someone submit that one in writing. So if we can tag that one, if we know who it came from, we'd be happy to answer that. Or if you would like to submit a similar question, just send it to that nitsa.national911@dot.gov email address.
Okay. Okay, in regards to the formula, once the states applying are known, is a calculation based on total population of the U.S. and total public miles in the U.S., or only those states applying?
You know, this is Lori again, I don't have that memorized, but I know that the formula that is the basis for this grant program was published in the final regulation. It's pretty clear what the sources are for that information. Let me see if I can find that section. But it is in the final rule.
Yep.
It is based on population and road miles, but I don't have the sources memorized.
The next one I will take is, would a state 911 program need a separate DUNS and SAM registration for this grant? Check with your legal representation in your state. Several states do not allow that, in that a state is a single governmental entity and they do not allow agencies of that state. But that is up to you and up to your state, so I would check with your state on that one. Do we need to include the spending plan with our certification? Not for step or phase one or the step one of the application. If the state is determined to be ineligible due to diversion, are tribal organizations in that state still eligible? I think we'll take that one offline.
Whether or not tribes are still eligible, I think that we will, have our chief counsels answer that one, and so if it could be submitted or tagged, that would be great.
I'm not sure what that question is. The question is, I'm not sure if you're looking the budget with the certification or the plan on how the funds will be administered, i.e. through a technical advisory committee. As we talked about, it's a two-step process. The first step is your state coordinator or your single point of contact and the certification. The second phase is the plan and the budgets. And if the plan is to use technical advisory committees to administer the funds, I think that would be in the plan itself. But that's step two. Somebody's asking if the submitted questions will be available to see. This webinar is being recorded. It will be posted probably in about a week for people to be able to go back in and look at it. Okay, will the final application be done through Grants.gov? Traditionally, the initial application is done through Grants.gov and then a different site for completion.
This is Lori. I know that different grant programs have different processes. I think for this one, we've tried to make it as clear as possible. So step one will be the submission of the certification via that email address. Step two will be via Grants.gov.
Will we be able to submit our certification before the deadline so it can be reviewed and can provide any corrections if needed?
This is Lori Flaherty again. We've already received 4 or 5 certifications. Certainly they can be submitted anytime up to and including September 10th.
I'm going to read this question, but I'm going to suggest that they reach out to the office directly. If a state has a contract in place with a technical consultant prior to grant award, is the use of that consultant eligible for reimbursement? I would suggest you submit that question to the office by email. Okay. We're through the set of questions up till this point. So we're going to move on to some available tools and resources that will be available for folks to use. So the first one is the frequently asked questions. So some of the information that we've talked about here today is available on the frequently asked questions. The number one resource for all applicants is the 911.gov website. There is a grant page on 911.gov, and it has links to the final rules, to the NOFO, to the Grants.gov site, as well as documents and information that is pertinent to this. So the first step is to go to the 911.gov, and again, on that website is this frequently asked questions document. In addition to that, we have created an optional checklist. This is not a step-by-step direction. It's just a high-level, don't forget this, don't forget that type of thing. It is completely optional, but it's available for you to use. It does have some of the links in it. That will be emailed out to everyone after this. And the last but not least is a budget template. This budget template is also optional, but it has been created with post-award in mind. It is very close to following what's in the grants tracking system to make it easy for folks to submit afterwards. But again, it is strictly an optional document. There are several links to the final rule, the funding opportunity. One of the other areas to look into is the Grants.gov Learning Center, which has helpful tutorials on how to use Grants.gov. Links to the SAM, DUNS lookup, and other Grants.gov tutorial videos. All right, well, thanks everybody for doing this. We're going to open the floor up for questions. Once again, at the bottom of your screen, there are the little bubbles. The one with the little cartoon bubble is the chat feature. So feel free to enter your questions in that way. Let's go back. Next question. Am I understanding that local 911 centers are not eligible for this grant?
This is Lori. I can answer that by saying that in the final rules, section 400.3 states pretty clearly who may apply for the grant program. In order to apply for a grant under this part, the applicant must be a state or tribal organization as defined in section 400.2. And for the purposes of this grant program, the District of Columbia and the territories are listed as a state in air quotes. However, one of the requirements of the certification is that the applicant must coordinate with local jurisdictions. So in the end, a state can do a project at the state level. They can provide sub-grants to local governments, or they can do some combination of those. We don't dictate those terms. It is entirely up to the state.
The next question, is it possible for an entity to view what entities have submitted an application for the grant after the September deadline?
This is Lori. That is not possible. Nope.
Does the budget we submit need to be a 4-year budget?
Well, I think you know, if you can expend the funds in 3 years, we're not making you, you know, extend the period of performance for the full 4 years. If it is your estimation that that's how long it will take, but you have up until, you know, 4 years after the award is made to expend the funds. Now, having said that, and having gone through this grant process before, we know that things change. We know that things take longer than you expect them to. We know sometimes things go wrong. It will be possible through that grants tracking system that Gordon described to make changes to your plan, and if we approve those changes, then that becomes your new plan. So, you know, you have up to 4 years to expend the funds, but you don't need to take all that time if you don't need it.
Next question is, what are diverted funds?
I am going to look at the final rule because I know actually that going back to the statute, it was pretty clear on, you know, there was even more language that than the 2009 grant allocations with regard to diversion. Let me look here. The applicant must certify that during the time period 180 days immediately preceding the date of application, the state has not diverted any portion of designated 911 surcharge funds imposed by the state for any purpose other than the purpose for which such charges are designated or presented, and that no taxing jurisdiction in the state that will be a recipient of grant funds has diverted any portion of designated 911 charges imposed by the taxing jurisdiction for any purpose other than the purpose for which the charges were designated or presented. That's in section 400.4 of the final rule.
Thank you. Will geospatial data development costs to support NG911 qualify for match?
I know that we allowed them in the last round of grants. Certainly if that falls within the hardware and software categories, it would be an eligible use of funds. I will tell you, we got questions in the last round of grants as to whether or not we pay for street signs, and the answer to that is no. But if it falls in the hardware and software category, then it would make sense to do that. All right.
Well, I will once again mention that if you want to submit a question, use the chat feature on the webinar. Well, it looks like we have finished up the questions at this point, but while we're pausing briefly, I'll reach out to Dan to see if he has any further or any additional comments or questions or issues to discuss.
No, just to thank everyone for participating. And again, you know, if there are follow-up questions, please submit them to the 911 account that Lori has cited, and we'll do our best to put our heads together and answer them as quickly as we can.
Okay. Lori, any additional?
No, sir. What he said. Thank you very much for participating.
Okay. Follow on to the initial or the last question on geospatial data. Was talking about address points. Is it just hardware or software? I would suggest you submit that question directly to the office after this webinar. explain what you're trying to accomplish and see if they can answer that way. The last one was they came in late, and is it only available to the states? Yes, we've talked, this legislation limited it to states, territories, and tribal organizations. So local 911s are not available at this point. Do all funds awarded need to be spent within the 4-year period?
This is Lori. The answer is yes.
And the next one was, what's the email address to ask follow-up questions? So I brought that slide up because I forgot to do that earlier. So the NHTSA.national911@dot.gov is the email address to submit your questions. And 911.gov website has the page for the grants themselves. Well, thank you all for attending, and as I said, here's the contact information if you have further questions following this. So please feel free to submit those to the office. Thank you very much.